to this meeting of the North Staffs branch of the Classical Association. I'm very pleased to welcome, I think it's fair to say, an old friend of the branch in Clemence, Schulze here, who is going to talk to us tonight on the story of Psyche in the 19th, 20th century art and fiction. Clemence has kindly given me a small biography by way of introduction, so I would say, of course, wouldn't I, that she studied a proper degree at a proper institution, namely Literae Humaniores at St Hilda's, Oxford, and later obtained a Pelham Scholarship to go to British School at Rome to study her DPhil, which was on Dionysius of Halicarnassus. She's lectured at Queen's Belfast and at Durham, and her research interests lie in historiography, material culture, particularly textiles in the ancient world, and in classical reception, which of course is what she's going to speak to us about this evening. So Clemence is a co-editor, of Charlotte Mary Young, writing in the Victorian age, a collection of essays which appeared at the end of last year for the bicentenary of Charlotte Young, which apparently is this year. So light has been cast on my darkness already. She's published a number of articles on the 19th century interpretation of classical myth, the most recent being Psyche and Cupid in the novels of Charlotte M. Young and Sylvia Townsend Warner in the reception of Apuleius. Also Cupid and Psyche from 1600 till today. Hercules amongst the Tractarians, typological readings in Isaac Williams. She's working on a chapter on Hercules in the forthcoming Blackwell Companion to Hercules, which no doubt will be forthcoming at some point. Clemence was the chair of the Barbara Pym Society from 2007 to 2013 and the Charlotte M. Young Fellowship from 2011 to 2021, and was particularly interested in changing attitudes to special providence in Victorian and post-Victorian fiction. Once the bicentenary this year is over, she hopes to get some time for her retirement hobbies of textiles and bookbinding. On that note, I therefore invite Clemence to talk to us about Psyche in the 19th and 20th century. Clemence.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all the organisers of this branch of the CA for their kind welcome and help in this. So, as you see, the title's been slightly adapted to Psyche Disguised. Scholars have long speculated that underlying the Psyche story, as we know it from Apuleius, is a widespread network of folk tales along the line of Beauty and the Beast and Cinderella, found in many cultures. And such a story is possibly traceable not in literature but in Greco-Roman art from as early as the 5th century BCE. There up on the left you have the first Psyche with butterfly wings, just about visible, and the frequent motif much later of Psyche and Cupid embracing, a very, very frequently found motif. Also, reciprocal tormenting, common on seals, found in Hellenistic poetry as well. The revenge on love or the revenge of love, plus also Eros burning Psyche herself. I couldn't find a picture of that, but not burning a butterfly, but burning a girl with a torch. So like the right-hand one, but an actual person. But of course it's Apuleius in his Metamorphoses, aka the Golden Ass, who has crystallized the story in a form that has persisted through the centuries, itself metamorphosing through many different versions and genres. Myriads of takes in the Middle Ages and Renaissance demonstrate the extraordinary plasticity and adaptability of this myth. And I owe an enormous debt to Jane Davidson Reid's comprehensive, though not totally exhaustive work, The Oxford Guide to Classical Mythology in the Arts, 1300 to 1990s, which was published in 1993. I estimate that around 400 works are mentioned, spanning those 7 centuries. Visual arts, all media, dance, opera, plays, poems, novels, also burlesque, caricature, and graphic novels. So, out of this, all of this plethora, what to select when examining the reception of such a plastic tale? I'm choosing 3 women, all well educated in classical languages and culture, who flourished over the very long 19th century, we have to say, into the 20th, actually. And their takes on the Psyche and Cupid story as one of female empowerment and gender roles, and looking at the distance they move in resetting the original to other times and places. They are Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Charlotte Mary Young, and Sylvia Townsend Warner. And incidentally, both Young and Warner escaped the net of Jane Davidson Reid's great compilation. First, a brief version of the story for Apuleius. I'm sure you all know the narrative, but please forgive this retelling. It's actually an excuse for these delightful illustrations. Psyche, youngest of 3 daughters of a king, is so surpassingly beautiful that she is worshipped like a goddess. Hence Venus grows angry and commands her son Cupid to punish the girl. Meanwhile, Psyche's father is told by an oracle to lead her out to a lonely mountain to become the bride of a monster. In grief and horror, Psyche's family and the citizens obey. Oops, sorry. We should only be at Zephyr. Zephyr then wafts her away to a secluded valley where she finds a strange and luxurious palace with every want supplied by invisible beings. Here a lover comes to her, always unseen in the night. He will not allow her to see him, however much she pleads to do so. Though he reluctantly allows Psyche's sisters to visit, he urges her to tell them nothing of him, but she cannot keep the secret entirely. He also informs her that she is pregnant. The visiting sisters are brought by Zephyr, and they become jealous of the marvellous palace and of Psyche's life there. They grow suspicious when she gives them 2 different versions of what her husband is like, and convince her that he must be a dreadful monster. When he is asleep, they say she must take a lamp, look at him, and kill him. And so here we have Psyche with the sword and the lamp. So when she finally sees him, she's overcome by his beauty and does not kill him. Instead, she gazes so avidly that the lamp drops some hot oil and burns him. Cupid chides her of faithless disobedience and flies away, and Psyche tries to cling to him but is abandoned. She wanders the world, wishing to die, but encounters Pan, who urges her to be worthy of her love and her lover. She then tells both her sisters, separately, rejected her and will now marry the respective sister. Expecting to be wafted off to him by Zephyr, each jumps off a mountain and dies. Sorry, I think I might have got, wait a minute, where are we? Oh, Psyche in series. We should have gone to that one ought to be first, that's right. Venus is furious, it's Cupid and Venus. This one, as you see, is the actual, not a plaster impression, but an actual seal. Venus is furious when she learns of Cupid's love for Psyche and his wish to marry her, vowing revenge, enlisting Ceres and Juno on her side. And so there we go back to Psyche and Ceres. So accordingly, when Psyche encounters them, neither will help her. Venus asks Jupiter to let Mercury help her. He finds Psyche, brings to Venus, who sets her several tasks. The first is to sort a great heap of mixed seeds, in which the ants give aid. Next, to fetch the golden wool of some ferocious sheep, and a river reed advises her on that. Thirdly, to draw a jar of water from the Styx, guarded by snakes, and an eagle does that for her. Finally, Venus wants her to visit the underworld for a casket of Proserpina's beauty secret. Psyche can only imagine that she needs to die in order to get to the underworld, but the tower from which she proposes to jump tells her a route via Taenarus and Charon's ferry, and how to propitiate Cerberus, all of which she carries out. There she is with Psyche and Proserpina. When Psyche has the jar, the casket, she cannot resist looking into it, and the contents cast her into a death-like sleep. Meanwhile, Cupid, now recovered from his wound, seeks and finds her, restoring her to consciousness with a prick of his arrow. While she takes Venus the casket, Cupid begs Jupiter's permission to marry her, which is granted, and Mercury is bidden to bring Psyche to Olympus. The wedding ceremony, Psyche is made immortal, fit bride for a god, and their daughter Voluptas is later born. So the seals, or plaster impressions, that I've used to illustrate the story link with the first of my long Victorian women writers. In this pair of seals, you'll recognise variants on the well-known statue in the Uffizi, excavated in the mid-18th century, much admired and widely copied for at least the next century. There it is on the left. Plus a reversed image of the same statue in a catalogue where it says statues antiques, and below, as you see, Pierre Gravé antique. Some of the mythological scenes carved on the gems of Prince Poniatowski's collection. So if you were the least bit suspicious of the style of the gems and plaster impressions I was showing you, you were right. For here is the villain of the piece. Count Poniatowski, nephew of King Stanislas II Augustus of Poland. This military man and statesman left his native country at some point after his uncle's abdication in 1798, living in Rome and Florence thereafter. There he amassed and caused to be created a vast collection of antiquities, including thousands of carved seals. These classical forgeries, for that is what they must be termed, are of exquisite workmanship, as you've seen. And Poniatowski actually had some craftsmen carve the seals, while other workers, other men, added the name of the supposed classical artist. You might have noticed little teeny names under the foot of the images. So these were published during the 1830s and were very soon recognised as modern creations. Recognised, that is, by most people, except those who had bought them at auction a few years after Poniatowski's death and wanted to uphold their genuineness. Though fakes, they are works of enormous skill, in themselves constituting a gallery of early 19th century neoclassical art. And there's an excellent classical art archive at Oxford that has them online, and they're still searching out more because they were so dispersed at the auctions that many of them must be hidden in collections and not recognised for what they are. So that brings us to Elizabeth Barrett Browning, a woman well educated in Greek and Latin and classical and European culture generally, of course. The publication of her poems in 1844, when she was 38, brought recognition and success immediately, and Robert Browning was by no means the only one who was struck by her talent. The work induced Anne Thompson, the daughter of a well-connected industrialist and a woman involved in the art world, to approach EBB in 1845 with a new project. This was a classical album of gems portraying mythological scenes to be accompanied by appropriate passages translated from classical authors. And it's Poniatowski's gems, of course. That's what's going to be used. And Elizabeth Barrett was asked to supply 10 verse translations to Apuleius. And here's not EBB yet, but Kenny's very good translation of the Zephyr passage. What she provided were less translations, exact translations, than close-ish adaptations, varyingly close. But at any rate, nothing came of the mooted publication, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning published the 10 poems later in 1850. So that's the Zephyr passage here, and then the next is Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem. And it's the only one I'm going to give you in full. Provides a good notion of her treatment. You see, she's using rhyme, and she conveys quite a lot of Apuleius's detail, but it certainly is not so much a true translation, a literal translation, as an adaptation. So, the core poem, or the key poem, this one, which is chronologically the first, but the one which she set first in the collection, and that is Psyche gazing upon Cupid, the torch and lamp and sword one. Barrett Browning has ignored Apuleius' chronology, and she places it before the Zephyr poem, and Stephen Harrison has commented that by beginning with Psyche's realization of love, rather than with her literal arrival at the palace, the poems constitute a sort of novelistic sequence with a little bit of flashback, and suggests that this looks ahead to Barrett Browning's full-length verse novel, Aurora Leigh. Of course, her choices are largely determined by which scenes are depicted on the Poniatowski gems, but the loose structure that she allows herself, some of the 10 poems are short, others quite lengthy, means that she can give greater importance to some scenes over others. And this section is the crucial one, representing a theme that will be addressed in both the other authors I'll be treating today. Psyche must change. She must become bolder. That we've got our Dacia in Apuleius' text. Change her sex, as Apuleius puts it. The courage is demanded of her. So that's going to be the point. Courage and the female facing a situation which demands an unfeminine approach. So I'll turn now to how my two other authors handle the story. In both, the narrative of Psyche's passage from innocence through ordeals to fulfillment can be regarded as a kind of Bildungsroman, and also recalls Gothic literature with its imperiled but ultimately empowered heroine. Such heroines tend to find themselves in liminal situations, in the liminal situation of girl turning to woman, encountering love and sexuality. Reception is such a manifold and intriguing phenomenon, but one of its strangest manifestations must be the association between Apuleius, sophist and alleged magician, and the Mrs. Young and Warner, that is, Miss Charlotte Mary Young, spinster of the parish of Otterbourne, and Miss Sylvia Townsend Warner, spinster in name only, of London and later of Dorset. Charlotte Mary Young, famed as a novelist chiefly owing to her bestseller The Heir of Redcliffe in 1853, passed her entire life in her native village just outside Winchester, where the tractarian, the Reverend John Keble, was her mentor during her girlhood. Her time, defined by duties to God, the High Anglican Church, and her family, was spent in extensive writing and study. In journalism, for over 40 years she edited a magazine for young women, and also in home, parish, and mission responsibilities. She never married, and if she'd been able to vote, she would certainly have been a Tory. Sylvia Townsend Warner's circumstances very slightly resemble Young's. The upper middle class background, for instance, her father was a master at Harrow School, and the fact that she was educated at home, and that later on she too lived permanently in a country village. But in other respects, nothing less like the home life of our dear Miss Young can be imagined. Sylvia Townsend Warner had a 17-year-long secret liaison with her musicological colleague Percy Buck. Then, in her 30s, she met and fell in love with poet Valentine Ackland. The two of them remained together for life, despite Valentine's infidelities and her problems with drink and depression. Ackland was a Roman Catholic convert. Sylvia Townsend Warner was wryly non-religious. Both were firmly committed to the radical left. And 50 years apart, Young and Warner each published a book on the Cupid and Psyche theme. Both of these can be seen as Bildungsromane of a kind, the development tale of a young woman undergoing changes and encountering situations that demand courage. I'm concerned today with their significant stresses on this theme, which we've already noted as coming straight from Apuleius into Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And I will also now note one also shared with Barrett Browning, their chief omission from their source material, and that is sex. Given that the Apuleian story has over many generations and through numerous artworks stood as the paradigmatic narrative of sexual love, this is a notable omission indeed. So here we have a comparison of their best-known works and their dates, where you see Love and Life on the left is a work of Young's later years, whereas The True Heart comes very early in Sylvia Townsend Warner's career as a novelist, 1929. Both books are cast as historical novels, full of period detail, set respectively in 1739, Young, and 1873, Townsend Warner. I just remark apropos, I think that is all Sylvia Townsend Warner's novels, if I'm correct. She is one of these remarkable writers in that every novel is totally different from all the rest. Every novel is unique. The same can't be said of Young, but that's not what we love her for. But Townsend Warner is a very marvelous novelist, and they're all utterly different. Anyway, to start with Young, in writing Love and Life, she draws on contemporary documents and novels for the period detail, as well as being utterly steeped in the works of Sir Walter Scott, her favourite novelist. So here's the title page of the 1885 edition, the first to be illustrated. And as you see, the full title, An Old Story in 18th Century Costume, explicitly draws attention to the dressing up of the fable of Cupid and Psyche. And the dressing up entails numerous character equivalencies with ingenious names for the modern, i.e. the 18th century counterparts. And here you have these names. The plot. This is a 400-page novel. I'm going to be very, very, very quick. Sir Amias Bellamore meets and falls in love with Aurelia Delavie, a distant relative of his own. To get Aurelia out of the way, his mother, Lady Bellamore, compels Aurelia's father to let his daughter go off to be a governess for Lady Bellamore's young children by her second marriage to Mr. Wayland. Aurelia finds Bowstead House frightening because of the presence of reclusive, dark-dwelling Mr. Amias Bellamore, Sir Amias's uncle, and his black servant. But she gradually learns to accept him and give him the Christian sympathy that helps lift his remorseful depression. Sir Amias discovers Aurelia's whereabouts and, with his uncle's consent, meets her in the darkened rooms and woos her, uncle always being present. Lady Bellamore is furious, and to protect Aurelia, uncle and nephew arrange a secret marriage. Aurelia believes she is marrying elderly Mr. Bellamore, but in fact her still unseen husband is young Sir Amias. After the marriage, her life at Bowstead continues exactly as before. One of Aurelia's sisters, well-meaning, not wicked, persuades her that out of self-respect, Aurelia ought not to continue to accept the ban on seeing her husband, and provides her with a light-making device. Aurelia uses it, and the surprise causes Sir Amias to fall concussed. Just as Aurelia discovers who her real husband is, Lady Bellamore arrives and threatens her with prosecution for damage and injury. Aurelia runs away, while Lady Bellamore consigns Mr. Bellamore to a private asylum. Aurelia, finding no help from any neighbour, you see there we've got Diana and Ceres and so on, visits a church where she repents of running away, choosing instead to throw herself on Lady Bellamore's mercy. She is imprisoned in a grim old London mansion in order to make her sign a disclaimer of her marriage. Lady Bellamore sets her two tasks. One is to search through documents for a secret recipe for cosmetics. When it's found, Lady Bellamore directs her to take this to Cora Dark, her perfumier. But Mrs. Dark is also a procuress who is to drug Aurelia and dispatch her abroad. Meanwhile, father and husband rescue Mr. Bellamore from the asylum and search for Aurelia. They are just in time to save her as she is put on Captain Cairn's ship, still unconscious. Lady Bellamore's husband, Mr. Wayland, returns from abroad to see justice done for his wife's wicked plotting. The next morning, Aurelia awakens to the presence and the knowledge of her true husband, Sir Amias. So, Gothic and sensation is very present here. Young's 18th century setting gives her the distancing of a period where persons of high status could, for their own advantage or convenience, ignore laws and maltreat inferiors. This allows her to place her heroine in hinted-at sexual danger on more than one occasion. Removal from her family, actual imprisonment, and abduction while drugged and unconscious that would take her overseas. CMY would simply never dream of having such events befall a character in one of her contemporary set novels. Bodice Ripper, however, this is not. I expect you won't be surprised that Young minimises the physical dangers and stresses rather than the moral threats of being disobedient and impatient, of lacking religious faith and trust that beset Aurelia. Young has, however, to deal with the wooing and marrying, while maintaining the strictest propriety and guarding to the utmost her heroine's modesty. Here the notion of bride but not wife comes into play. The sensation element of doubleness allows Aurelia to be, as she thinks, alone in a darkened room with an elderly man, that's Mr. Amias, repentant and reclusive, to whom she reads, talks, and brings towards a Christian hope, while strengthening her own faith. So she achieves a degree of intimacy, liking, and trust with Mr. Amias Bellamore. But on some occasions, unknown to her, a third person is present, Sir Amias, the nephew. A different, more animated voice sometimes addresses her. There's an occasional touch on her hand, a sensation of mysterious excitement to which she shyly responds. The secret marriage that will protect Aurelia from the machinations of Venus is not, of course, with the elderly uncle as she believes. She respects and trusts him, but does not love him. And Young carefully indicates that 18th century mores mean that an arranged marriage like that would be nothing extraordinary. But of course the husband, unknown to Aurelia, will of course be young Sir Amias, with whom Aurelia does not yet know that she is in love. CMY here hints delicately at a degree of excitement and potential physical attraction which the girl can scarcely understand. But of course, Young's principles require that a marriage, a secret marriage, you see, Young's very, very high church. It sort of is a proper marriage, but it should really be in a church, etc., etc. So her rules sort of say it's not quite a marriage, it must be unconsummated. Aurelia obediently remains in the same status in the household, unchanged except for knowing herself to be married, and having, therefore, the duty not to disown that marriage in the ordeals subsequently imposed on her by Lady Bellamore. In those ordeals, which involve de facto imprisonment in an isolated house maintained by a jailer-like old crone, Young is as careful as any chaperone could be that Aurelia is never alone with a man. Moreover, in the most physically frightening episode, the abduction downriver to the ship, which is to take her to the plantations, the girl is unconscious and has a woman servant with her. Well, so much for attraction, sex, and marriage. The other very striking divergence from Apuleius is the role of the sisters, always a problem, I feel. Young was herself a sister, a protective and financially supportive one to an only brother. And she represents in her fiction, as well as knowing in real life, many sets of devoted sisters. One feels that she simply could not bear to portray wicked sisters in any way, shape, or form. And yet the story requires that someone has the authority to push the heroine into attempting to see her unknown husband. Young stays with her original so far as having two sisters. The much elder one, Betty, staid, loving and maternal, who has taken the dead mother's role in the family and is good through and through, and the rather foolish Harriet, a bit flighty, a bit mischievous, but far from actually wicked. And indeed, she is commonsensical insofar as she cannot understand the prolonged need for darkness and secrecy after the marriage. She convinces Aurelia that for her own safety and self-respect, she must find out the truth of the strange sensation of a third person's presence. Since Harriet's clergyman husband is a man of science, a substance is available to provide the sudden light. I think it must be something along the lines of gun cotton. And naturally, there's no suggestion that Aurelia should have the intention of killing anyone, whether man or monster. The injury to young Sir Amias is caused by an accident as the fire breaks out after the bright explosion. And nor, of course, is there any question of revenge upon the sisters, always a rather difficult notion for readers to combine with the heroine's virtue. In the preface to Love and Life, a later edition of Love and Life, we read Young's thinking about the myth. Apuleius himself either found or adapted it to the idea of the soul awakened by love, and love then losing it, and so on. I'll let you read it for yourselves. Even in heathen philosophy, strain towards the higher love just glimpsed. And then she tells us explicitly that it is Christianized as an allegory of the soul or the church, and the bridegroom is Christ or God, striving after him through many trials. So her intention is that the Psyche story is to be read typologically. In the words of the Tractarian poet Isaac Williams, they spoke of things more glorious than they knew. In his cathedral poem, this was a quotation favoured by Tractarians who discerned in the pagan, in inverted commas, writers of classical antiquity, the foreshadowing of Christian belief. Just as Old Testament persons related as types to the Christian antitype, so too could classical figures function typologically. John Keble, as Professor of Poetry at Oxford in the 1830s, laid out a system of typological thinking that he applied both to nature and to literature, even literature of the pre-Christian era, and that's summarised here. Rather than quoting from Keble, I've actually given a nifty summary in the words of Gavin Budge. It all works within a providential economy where God has organised everything. This conception, which also entails a hermeneutical practice of close reading, applies to other literary forms beyond poetry, including the novel. Charlotte Young, who first met Keble in 1836 when she was 13, and she went on to be prepared by him for confirmation, was greatly influenced by Keble's thinking and discussed with him her books in progress. Not this one, obviously, he was dead by then. But not surprisingly, what Budge has called typological realism pervades her own approach to novel writing, informing minute details of plot and characterization. And moreover, the quality of reserve was as vital to Tractarian aesthetics as to their theology and liturgy. Allegory and typology were embraced as being appropriate to the treatment of doctrine and belief. This applied equally to poetry, to novels, and to children's tales. The minutest details of natural phenomena or everyday life point, by analogy, to spiritual truths that are to be grasped ever more fully. And this quotation from Love and Life, as she reads an inscription on the tombstone, exactly sums up the process of ever fuller perception of divine truth. She knew better what that text meant than she had done when younger, a sense of divine love, trust, love, etc., etc. So a novel such as Love and Life is accordingly typological not only in its overall structure, the mapping of a soul's progress onto a classical myth, but in many tiny individual points of plot, theme, and incident. So I turn now to, more briefly, to Sylvia Townsend Warner and The True Heart, the cover of the Virago edition, and the Essex marshes that Sylvia Townsend Warner tells us was the inspiration for the novel. Although she probably read Apuleius in the original, she may very well have known the version of the Cupid and Psyche story within Walter Pater's novel Marius the Epicurean, where it figures as a tale shared between incipient lovers, and possibly also Edward Carpenter's translation, a fairy tale style version, first published in 1900 and paired in that edition with a translation of Iliad 1. He considered that Cupid and Psyche was really a Greek narrative, and that Apuleius's version was no more than a rather debased, well, debased is perhaps going a bit far, late and rather trite Roman version. He stressed the primitive nature of the origins of the story and of Greek society as a whole. And certainly there are elements about the heroine that are primitive, naive, and simple. But Warner was an extremely well-read woman, and she was very likely aware of other works beyond Carpenter's in a tradition of writing that intersects sexology and mythology. For example, she had read Freud. So, yet another plot. Oh no, sorry, that's her explaining that the Essex marshes is where it all comes from. This strange, open, unmoving landscape. The plot. Suki Bond, a 16-year-old orphan whose main characteristic is a naive obedience, is sent from her London orphanage to a job arranged for her by one of the orphanage's supporters, Mrs. Seaborn. We know who that is. This is with an Essex farming family called the Nomans. They are also housing Mrs. Seaborn's simple idiot, is the word used, son, Eric, as he is unhappy in his own home and his mother is ashamed of him. He is kind but remote, good with animals, and cannot bear inflicting pain. He and Suki fall in love and wish to marry. They kiss and fondle, but do nothing more. Prudence Gulland, who equates to a sister in the mapping of the Apuleius story, Prudence, a former servant in the house, but now engaged to one of the Noman sons, asserts herself over Suki by forcing her to kill a chicken by spiking its gullet. Suki tries to get Eric to help her, feels failed by his lack of understanding, and finally kills the bird herself with a hatchet. This causes Eric to fall in a fit, and a furious Mrs. Seaborn descends and takes him back to her own house. In a phase of wandering, Suki appeals in vain to Mrs. Seaborn and also encounters a helpful tramp, an apple woman, and a brothel keeper who does not take advantage of her, though recognising her astonishing naivety. Having left the Noman's farm, Suki finds a job at another one, where Prudence visits her and tells her how Mrs. Seaborn has been hurt and aggrieved by social slights resulting from this hitherto unknown son now coming to live with her. Seeing the picture, The Secret of England's Greatness, Suki conceives the notion that Mrs. Seaborn's pain will be assuaged if she, Suki, can get Queen Victoria to present Mrs. Seaborn with a Bible. She goes to London, meets someone who can take her to the mourning Queen, and receives the Bible. Mrs. Seaborn, maddened by disgrace, loss and grief, spurns the Bible, while Suki and Eric meet up again. Mr. Warburton, Jupiter, the orphanage's chief patron and a relative of Mrs. Seaborn, arrives to sort out the situation of everybody. He sends Mrs. Seaborn for a rescue abroad and sets Suki and Eric up in a bee farm. I know it sounds really strange, and it is 250 pages. You know, it's not a hugely long novel, but encapsulated like that, it sounds strange, but it is, I assure you, a most striking novel. So I'm going to select three aspects in which Suki's story represents a feminist form of the Cupid and Psyche story, embodying female empowerment. Not unlike Young's portrayal of Aurelia's growth of soul during her ordeals and her isolation, Townsend Warner shows Suki growing from obedience to self-assertion. She is absolutely the perfect orphan, knack for obedience. She can do anything as she's told. She does exactly what she's told. So that's her salient characteristic, a paradigm of obedience. And when she is sent out to service, she's expected to fulfill an impossible ideal of dutifulness. £10 a year, nothing more was required than honesty, industry, cleanliness, sobriety, obedience, punctuality, modesty, judge of England principles, good health, and a general knowledge of housework, about washing, mending, and plain cooking. Townsend Warner's humour is apparent here. But despite all this obedience, she does grow in self-assertion. So when she comes to leave the no man's farm, she is able to assert herself against Mr. No Man, who is the person here. He began again. He's rather annoyed that she's leaving, and she is now resolute enough, able enough, brave enough indeed, to stand up and not give in to him. So that's some self-assertion. She's also growing in understanding and self-knowledge. Growth in knowledge of herself and others, including, of course, an understanding of what it is to love, even though neither she nor Eric have any notion about sex, and only Suki knows that marriage is both a ritual and a contract. Eric simply says, we'll go into a church and say we're married, and then we'll be married. And even Suki knows that's not quite how it's done. So this love acknowledged climaxes in the scene of killing the cockerel. She looks at him, she gazes, she forgets everything. Now this awful task, this killing, has been forced on Suki by her quasi-sister Prudence. But in the end, it's motivated by Suki's despair, as Eric fails what amounts to a test. He can't give her any help with the bird. But the despair brings enlightenment. She recognizes him for what he is, utterly gentle, and that he cannot help, and she still loves him. So a test for him that he has failed conversely demonstrates to her love for him. And then that constitutes the physical wound that she inflicts upon him. She kills the cockerel, but he falls as if dead. His face convulsed, his breath snoring and sobbing. And the world, like the coarse and malicious Prudence, sees an idiot in a fit. What a way to go on, says Prudence. Carry on over an idiot with a fit. And Suki, nevertheless, still loves him. So her love has been recognised, proved, and tested. And she moves... I forgot to put a heading on that one. She also moves from naivete to discernment. At the outset, she's unquestioning of her own role and her perceived duty of absolute obedience. And she's guileless in her dealings with people, and thus is, of course, taken advantage of. But gradually, she learns better how to engage with others so that they will act in her interest. It's not exactly manipulation, but it is towards that, more of a learning process. And she doesn't always succeed in it. And this is an instance of not succeeding. She's encountering Mrs. Seaborn, and she's appealed by pleading, first of all, her love for Eric, and that makes no impact on his mother, since the mother dislikes him anyway. And so now she brings out, as it were, her imagined pregnancy, because she believes she's pregnant because she thinks you get pregnant by kissing. So she genuinely believes it. And so she's trying to use shame as a weapon against a woman who has been ashamed enough of her own son to hide him away. And Sylvia Townsend Warner's scholars have pointed out that Mrs. Seaborn's characterization as a eugenicist, and they've related that to Warner's own efforts on behalf of handicapped people. But even this, the shame is not great enough. It doesn't have an effect on the woman who, as the reader soon realizes, is passing from assertive pride to actual madness. But Suki gets better at manipulating people as things go on. She gets herself to London, rather like Jeannie Deans in Heart of Midlothian, walking to London to beg mercy from Queen Caroline. She gets herself to London to beg Queen Victoria for a Bible. And the inspiration is that she has seen a reproduction of this painting. by Barker, Queen Victoria presenting a Bible. And that, Suki believes, will rehabilitate the humiliated Mrs. Seaborn. And so the Queen asks her, who sent her, Mrs. Seaborn or her husband? No, says Suki, it's herself. Or maybe her children. Does she have children? Didn't they put you up to it? And Suki won't lie, but obviously something makes the Queen suspicious. Has she children, this Mrs. Seaborn? Your Majesty, she has one son, and this son, what of him? Your Majesty, I am afraid he is not a comfort to her just now. The perfect answer at that time to the Queen, whose own son, of course, was far from satisfactory just at that time. Suki has not lost her candour, but she's gained insight and perceptiveness, marking a further stage in her growth towards autonomy. And similarly, in a passage I haven't put on the PowerPoint, in her interaction almost at the end with Mr. Warburton, equivalent Jupiter, Suki artfully suggests for herself and Eric the sort of life that Eric will need for his well-being. A country life, not farming, not hunting, but keeping bees. And she artfully suggests this in such a way that Mr. Warburton accepts it as his own idea. So he sets them up in rural beekeeping idyll, and the time jumps, and the book's final scene shows her in childbirth, a more decisive rite of passage than anything she has yet undergone. If I bear a son, she said, I will call him Sorrow. But if it is a girl child, she shall be called Joy. And thus the book ends. Now, maybe it is partly owing to the richly deployed background material. Both books are full of physical examples of behaviour, clothing, furniture, all that kind of thing. They're very detailed in their settings. So maybe it was that meant that the underlying Apuleian model was totally unrecognised by early readers of both books, despite the intentions of their authors and the plethora of clues they had offered. The new edition had this added preface. The first edition of this tale was put forth without explaining the old fable, etc., etc. And she actually then proceeds after this passage to give a brisk summary of that fable. But the preface here allows her to explain her subject matter, making it clear that, like several earlier rehandlings, her version is to be read as a Christian allegory. And it is totally amazing that the readers had failed to notice, right from the subtitle, as I pointed out, an old story in 18th century costume, to the very final words, are a pastiche letter from real Mrs. Montague to real Mrs. Carter about the fictional hero and heroine. They are said to have gone through a series of adventures as curious as they are romantic. And indeed, when they made their appearance, it's a general whisper begun by young Mr. Walpole of Cupid and Psyche. Did they not get it? No, apparently not. And then in Warner's preface, the 1929 edition was reprinted as a facsimile by Virago, got the same pagination and everything, and she added a preface then. She tells us her rationale of taking a folk song or fairy story, retelling it. She uses elsewhere in the preface the metaphor of canto fermo, because, as I said, she was a musicologist, canto fermo for how she will, as it were, do the counterpoints of the various themes. And explains, for example, like Mrs. Oxley, Juno, the patient of marriage, only by the provision of brothels could modest women retain their virtue, so on and so forth. These disguises were so efficient that no reviewer saw what I was up to. Only my mother recognised the basis of this story. So I hope to have shown you something of the plasticity of the Cupid and Psyche myth, that enabled two authors so different in approach to turn it to their very diverse ends, and in such a way that their respective first cohorts of readers did not recognise the psyche butterfly as it flitted past. Thank you. And there's a tiny, weeny basic reading list at the end.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I think, if we may now, Clemence, this is custom in practice in this branch, I'll go through a little bit of housekeeping, and then if you would be prepared to field questions.
Of course,
that would
of course.
be very grateful. So we're coming to the end of this year's range of activities, but there are still a couple, possibly a third, waiting in the wings. So the next actual activity will be a reading through in English, I have to stress, of the Cyclops episode from Homer's Odyssey. Text will be available for that, so again, you've no need to come, don't need to scuttle off to a bookshop or whatever, although I'm sure we've all got one anyway. And there will be further details coming forward if you want to participate in that. That will be at 7:30. Again, it will be here in Keele Hall, but not in this room, in the SCR bar. So, like the Cyclops, one could refresh oneself, perhaps not quite to the degree of the Cyclops. And that will be on the 20th of April. The other formal event, which is on the programme, is our coach trip, which will be on the 20th of May, which is a Saturday. It will be going again from here in Keele, and it will be going to the remains of Wroxeter, a Roman town just outside of Shrewsbury, and also to Wall, again a small Roman town, this time on the edge of Lichfield. So once again, there will be further details circulated. That there is, of course, I'm afraid, a price attached to that one. We have to hire the vehicle and the driver that will take us there. So there will be a price, and that will all be announced in due course. But if anyone is interested, please do contact our secretary via the branch webpage to make us aware that you'd like to go. The third event, which may or may not happen, is again, some members may be aware that this is the 850th anniversary of the Borough Charter being granted to Newcastle under Lyme. And the intention of the council is to celebrate Newcastle throughout history, not just from the Charter onwards, but also bits beforehand. And we are hoping that we will be able to have a little talk up at the Apedale Heritage Centre, probably, about Newcastle and indeed Holditch in the Roman period. That's yet to be arranged, and again, as soon as it is arranged, we will release details of that. Those, I think, are the remains of the programme as set before me. I don't think I've missed anything out, but I look to our Secretary Stephen, who will no doubt put me right if I'm wrong. But he seems to think I'm right, which is possibly a first. So on that note, if Clemence is happy, I'd invite questions from the floor. And maybe I can steal the chairman's privilege by asking one thing that struck me. I mean, Charlotte Young strikes me as a rather sort of prim lady in some ways. Apuleius' Golden Ass is a somewhat, from her point of view, scabrous volume. I mean, it starts with naughty things, and indeed naughty things occur throughout. So why did she write upon this? Obviously, Apuleius, people see Apuleius and the Golden Ass as a big allegory in and of itself. Did she come to it with that in mind? It seems a most unlikely text for such a woman. That is sort of another of my question.
Shall I answer from here? Is it going to pick it up? Yeah. I suspect that it was the Cupid and Psyche episode being seen as almost a self-standing part. Adlington's translation. Mrs. Tighe, the Irish poet, who rendered it into Spencerian stanzas in the early 19th century. She knows both. She certainly knows both of them. And by the time she's writing Love and Life, Morris has also done the portion of the Earthly Paradise that uses the story. I think she probably is very little aware, if at all, of the whole of the Golden Ass, I suspect. But she knew this whole range of derived works that treat Cupid and Psyche as a thing of itself.
That seems to be very plausible, because as I say, it just seems a very odd sort of thing for her to light upon. So is it right to say that this detached thing had taken on a life of its own? And given what you said about the later novel and reviewers failing to pick this up, do we know anything about the reviews of Young's novel? I mean, was this picked up in any way there, or again did it sort of fall upon stony ground?
I suspect it did. I haven't. By this stage in her career, she's starting to be less regarded as a novelist for grown-ups, which she certainly was in the early part. Her big novels, the ones of the 1850s to the mid-60s, were widely reviewed in big proper journals, and all kinds of people read them. People like Gladstone read them. By the 1880s, she's on a downward trajectory. Partly to give her due credit, I mentioned the brother and said support, emotional and financial. He would have been declared bankrupt if she hadn't financially rescued him from. He made some unwise investments. And she sold her copyrights and set up a virtual sort of writing factory. So that's happened in the 70s and 80s. So she's writing more. The quality's going down. She's getting older. She's starting to be regarded more as a writer for teenagers, not younger children. She's getting fewer reviews and they're more cursory. So it doesn't surprise me that wasn't picked up, probably. And it must have been, as it were, not picked up, obviously enough, for her actually to attach the preface to the second edition. It must have maybe people said to her, what a nice story, I'm so into the 18th century stuff, blah, blah, blah. And she goes, didn't you realise? Well.
Any further questions? Chris?
I'm just wondering why you think people didn't pick it up. I mean, was it so disguised, or it just wasn't?
I mean,
these stories, because immediately you've mentioned Beauty and the Beast, and you think, oh, well, yes, but so was it just...
I mean, you'd think the clues would be enough, even if you hadn't realised, even if you thought, I'm reading a novel about the 18th century, and it's full of stuff about what their clothes would have been like, and what the posset they drank at night, and everything. There's lots of stuff like that, and the travelling, coming in a coach from the country, all kinds of period details. As I said, she adored Scott. Scott was the first novelist she was allowed to read as a child, and she was rationed to a chapter a day. So she knows her Scott inside out. And of course, Waverley itself is set very much in that period. And she's interested in 18th century letters and biographies and so on as well. So she's got all that stuff at her fingertips, and it fills the book. That's just the surface. Must have been, surface decoration must have been so intense that people, just read it as a historical novel, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, it seems strange to us that they missed these clues, but then we know we came to listen to you talk about Cupid and Psyche. So it's a bit of a circular argument, I suppose.
Townsend Warner, perhaps a little more, a little easier to miss. I was looking up it's the least studied of all her novels, I think, because it's the least political, and the least obviously feminist, and many other things. It's the least. And the person I put on the handout there, Schaller, is the most recent scholar to address it, and she admits these various difficulties that people have with the novel, and says that also, you know, it didn't the reviewers didn't seem to know quite how to handle it. It got cursorily reviewed or not reviewed at all, because of course it came after Lolly Willows, which had been that was a terrific success. People were enchanted. Do people know? Do you know that? It's about a woman who goes and lives in the remote. Guess where? The remote Chilterns. Possibly they were more remote then. The remote Chilterns, and becomes a witch. And it's wonderful. All her novels are utterly wonderful, and it's quite different from the True Heart. Perhaps they were expecting another Lolly Willows and they certainly didn't get it. And then when I can't remember quite the order of her novels, but there's one set in the 1848 revolutionary period, there's another one set in a convent, and it's not just that the settings are different, the whole thrust of each narrative is totally different, which you can say, I think, of so very few novelists, that each of their works is unique and self-standing.
So does Charlotte Young pick up other ancient stories?
Yes, one other, which is Hercules. She brings Hercules to a family home in around about the 1850s. He's an Australian, and all the labours occur appropriately, and his obviously again it's an allegory of his spiritual development. He's been mad with murdering or causing the accidental death of his wife Megara, and how he comes to a kind of redemption, again full of in this instance, of course, virtually contemporary detail, set at a period when Young herself was, alive and an adult. So I think those are the only two. She wrote many historical novels that are just sort of pure historical novels, but what people like nowadays are, on the whole, her contemporary set ones, the family chronicles, interlacing families and generations and so on. Those are the ones that people tend to go for.
That was very interesting, but I've never read either novelist. Charlotte Young is in that long list of people that I've always meant to try sometime. Maybe this will inspire me too. I at least was aware of her reputation. Sylvia Townsend Warner was never more than a name to me, so I was a little bit intrigued to hear you talk about her, and her father being a Harrow master.
Yes.
What was his subject? And I do have a reason for asking this.
Now, I'm pretty sure he was a historian.
Yes.
Pretty sure.
I rather thought you were going to say that, although, goodness knows, many Harrow schoolmasters would be a classicist or something. But the reason I ask is that when I was a little boy, there was a thing called the Townsend Warner History Prize.
Oh.
And all these little boys at prep school were invited to take part in this contest. We went along at a given time and answered an enormous number of questions on history. And in retrospect, it's quite fascinating. There were sort of one sentence answers or one name answers. Who said wait and see? If you happen to know, you would write Mr. Asquith. If you didn't, you'd say goodness knows. What happened to Lord Kitchener? Well, I didn't know that he was drowned. I I remember putting in sheer guesswork, killed in battle.
Very sensible.
Like so many field marshals.
Anyway, presumably somebody in some school or other was sufficiently clued up in history at the age of 12 or 13 that they got them all right. Anyway, Townsend Warner being an unusual name, many years later I became aware that there was a woman writer in the early 20th century who had that surname. But this, of course, makes it clear, and that was the connection.
Yes, that will be it. I think he was one of those schoolmasters who really inspired people. Though it doesn't sound as if such a prize of such a very factual nature of knowledge is perhaps the best way of remembering.
No, it does seem a bit quaint, but I suppose in the 1960s, and our school had a headmaster who looked as though he'd been operating before 1914. You may say that there were bits of very old-fashioned education which hung on to the 1960s.
There's a certain amount of memoir stuff and letters and so on, and, as well as biography of her. And I made a sustained effort to find out whether she had possibly read Love and Life. And I think it's not at all unlikely that she may well. In the nursery, it was kind of a very traditional but intellectual nursery, as it were, that she could have read some of the other Charlotte Youngs, but there was no way of proving in any way that she'd read this one. Or of course she'd have had access to the father was a housemaster, she'd have had access to a house library, but you can't, or I couldn't get any records of that.
Difficult to prove.
Very difficult, yes. She was an avid, she's obviously an incredibly bright child, avid reader from, age of 2 kind of thing, one of those kind of children.
You mentioned Mr. Gladstone reading Charlotte Young, but of course he read everything.
He read everything, yes.
Did other Tractarians light upon this story? I mean, is it something that Charlotte Young was interested in, qua Charlotte Young, or is it something that was part of an intellectual movement she was part of and thought that this was a sort of appropriate way to push things forwards?
I haven't found others. The main person for looking at what they were interested in classical literature is, of course, Keble. The extensive lectures on poetry that he gave as Professor of Poetry, which he was for a decade. It's roughly 1831 to 1840, thereabouts. And, two massive volumes in Latin, of course, not translated into English till 1912. And he talks about practically everybody that you can think of, with special admiration for Homer, Aeschylus, Pindar, and Virgil. And this whole interpretative, typological mode of reading runs through it all. And though I won't say I've read every single word of it, I can't recall that Apuleius gets in there anywhere. He may do. It's something that I'll have to check. So, thanks for reminding me about that. But no, I haven't come across that, say, not in Isaac Williams either.
My guess is that you're right. Apuleius wouldn't seem to me to be an Oxonian author at that period. And it's interesting, isn't it? Keble goes for some of the hardest stuff that's out there, really. But, there you are there any more questions? In that case, I think I should end by saying, Clemence said to me that, if you are inspired to go off and read this, the Charlotte Young anyway is out there free, gratis and for nothing on the internet. So you can hunt that one down anyway. But once again, thank you very much, Clemence, for a very interesting talk, and certainly some byways of the 19th century that I haven't heard of, and I may well go off and suck this thing down and have a look at it. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.